In the elite political bubble, next week's debate between Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden, well, it's must-see television. For many, it's being touted as an event that might even change the course of this presidential election. On Main Street, however, really not that big a deal. Only about a third of voters, 34%, even know the debate is scheduled for next week. And among those who know it's coming, well, fewer than half of them say they're definitely going to watch. In fact, only about 15% of voters overall know the debate is happening and are really committed to watching it. That's one reason the debate is not likely to have much of an impact on election 2024. It will be an audience of political professionals and hardcore partisans, not swing voters. Now, despite that small audience, some commentators expect, or maybe they hope for, news coverage of the debate could change the course of the election. And there's a little bit of historical evidence suggesting that could happen, emphasis on could. Back in 1976, there was an October debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. It was watched by 64 million viewers. Polls taken immediately after the debate suggested that all those viewers thought Gerald Ford had won the debate. But on that October night, Ford committed a major gaffe. He claimed there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. He meant to say something a little different. It just came out wrong. But for 3 days, there was intensive news coverage focused on that gap. After all that news coverage, viewers changed their mind. Polls showed that most voters now thought Carter had won the debate. When all was said and done, Carter won the popular vote that year by just 2 percentage points. It was close enough that perhaps the news coverage of that debate changed the outcome. Probably not, but it may have played a role. Still, that's very unlikely to happen this year for 3 reasons. First, the Ford-Carter debate took place less than a month before Election Day. It was still in the news as people cast their ballots. Next week's event, well, it's kind of like a preseason baseball game that will be long forgotten by the World Series. Second, both Ford and Carter were relatively unknown. Neither of them had ever run a national political campaign before. Both were in the race because of somewhat fluky circumstances. As a result, there was still a lot for voters to learn about those candidates. That's obviously not the case this year. In fact, in 2024, I suspect there's a lot of people who would like to forget a lot of things about both the candidates. But the third reason this news coverage is not likely to change the results this year, there were only 3 television networks back in 1976. They attracted more than 90% of the primetime audience. Oh, and by the way, they were far more trusted than any media outlet today. After that debate in 1976, all 3 of those networks pursued the same story from the same angle. It was an angle that helped Carter. There was no pushback from conservative media platforms because there weren't any. That pushback might have offered a different view, putting Ford's comment in a less damaging light. Now, today's media environment, nothing like that. There are no mass audiences. Nobody gets 30, 40, 90% of the audience share. And there's also very little trust in the media. Only 40% of voters consider CNN, the debate host, to be a legitimate news source. More see it as an organization pushing a partisan agenda. Not surprisingly then, just 40% believe the CNN media hosts will be neutral and unbiased. On top of that, well, after the debate, the media platforms are going to pursue all kinds of different angles. Unlike 1976, there will be pushback. Before the debate even begins, voters know that Democratic-leaning media outlets like the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC will try to spin the results in a way that trashes Donald Trump and helps Joe Biden. Voters also know that Fox News and other conservative-leaning media outlets will do just the opposite. So Republican voters will hear about Joe Biden's mistakes and stumbling. Democrats will hear news about Trump's outrageous statements, and nobody will change their mind. The bottom line, next week's debate is likely to have very little impact on election 2024. Events in the real world will have more of an impact than events in the world of political theater. Those are my thoughts.
I love politics, and so I don't look at it as the Super Bowl, but I do look at it as sort of the season playoffs. Let's say that. So I think that it could be interesting what happens here if you have Joe Biden going, or Trump going, "Hey, let's talk about shark attacks." Anything could happen. That would make news.
That would make news, and yes, if there's a big moment where Joe Biden freezes, and I mean for an extended period of time.
Or Donald Trump.
Or Donald Trump. It's hard to imagine him being more outrageous than he was 4 years ago in the debates. But yes, something could happen that would be so big they'd have to report it, and it could lead to a change. Yeah. But I don't think that's likely. For Biden, the bar is very low. He's likely to exceed it. And for Trump, he will say some outrageous things, but that won't surprise anybody.
And if you want, the war between Israel and Hamas remains in the headlines. But as events surrounding the hostages, the campus protests, and the conditions in Gaza have evolved, so has public opinion. So, Scott, where do Americans stand right now? What about where the United States should be?
Well, when you talk about right now, it's a lot different than it was back in October. You know, shortly after we saw those first videos and heard about the attacks, 62% of voters said that we should be supporting Israel. Pretty quickly after the response began, support began to dip all the way down to 37% in February and March. You see a little uptick after that. That came because of the campus protests. When the protesters got started, people said they're wrong, so we're going to support it. We should support Israel a bit more.
Interesting.
But even that has begun to fade. When you talk about this, there's another side, which is where did all that support go? It did not go to the Palestinians. It did not go from saying we should support Israel to supporting Hamas. It went from supporting Israel in the very beginning, that was the biggest component, to saying we should stay out. We should,
Well, you don't, at the very beginning, you see something like that, which was atrocious, and you say, yes, you have to react, but you don't know what that reaction is going to be. And as you watch the reaction, then people change their minds.
And we saw the same thing, different question, but same general trend. Do you approve or disapprove of Israel's response? The very beginning, of course you punch back. Somebody just raped and murdered people on your territory. Of course it's right to respond. But the reality of war is ugly. People don't want it. So we began to see support decline, and once again, we saw the gap close.
Right.
The number of people who disapproved, less than 25% on day one. Now it's almost as many as the number of people who say that they like the response of Israel.
Oh my goodness, President Biden's handling of the war, he's tried a bunch of stuff.
He has. About 1 out of 3 voters think he's doing a good job. That number hasn't moved much. It's been between 30 and 35% all along. It's a little bit better than the way people perceive his handling of the southern border, but not much else.
So who do they think that President Biden supports?
What we find, 42% of voters say, we think the president supports Israel. Smaller number, much smaller, 16% say Palestinian groups, and then you get to a still smaller number who think President Biden shouldn't be supporting either side. But here's the thing. This is an amazing trifecta President Biden has pulled off. Among people who believe we should be supporting Israel, well, fewer than half think President Biden does. Among people who believe we should be supporting the Palestinians, fewer than half think President Biden does. And among people who say we should be staying out entirely, fewer than half think that President Biden agrees with them.
You can't win for losing.
No.
So he's not making anybody happy.
He's not making anybody happy in this case, and that's a huge political problem.
Yeah, the campus protests, that's interested me because that has changed the way people have viewed things. And, of course, we also brought up the outside influences there.
Right. It did change the way people see things. Remember back to that very first table, support for Israel went up when the protests became news. Well, only 29% approve of the protesters, 59% disapprove.
Because it was so disruptive. If you go and protest, that's one thing. But when you're keeping other kids whose parents are paying for the tuition, by the way, out of classrooms, going Zoom, whatever, then it changes it.
And there was a strong hint of anti-Semitism and threats to Jewish students. I mean, there were a lot going on, yes. 25% of voters think these students are acting on deeply held beliefs. Most say, no, there was outside influence. That also detracts support from what they are doing.
The Biden administration made headlines this week with its expansion of Title IX to include protections, new protections for LGBTQ plus students. But not so fast. It was blocked in several states, with some members of the GOP describing the new rules as a tactic to get transgender students into girls' sports. It is a topic of loud political conversation and controversy. But what do Americans think? Scott, are they interested in Title IX? I mean, do they know about it?
Well, if we ask people what Title IX policies are, 25% say they know what they mean. But then when we ask a follow-up question, turns out only about 12% of Americans know them as Title IX policies. Partly that's because over the past 52 years, they've just become part of our society. And the explosion of women's sports in schools has been a phenomenal result of that legislation.
Yeah, 52 years today, I believe that they signed it. Now, the Biden administration has proposed altering this and letting people decide what team they want to play on based on their gender identity. That's their push.
Yeah, people aren't really excited about that. And this whole conversation gets a little dicey because of the terms that you use. You know, somebody's not sure what gender identity means or not sure how to ask the question. But nearly 6 out of 10 voters tell us they don't want to see this change taking place. They don't want to see this shift in the Title IX. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it. Basically, they think it's taking protections away from women. They think it's putting women in a dangerous situation.
Yeah, the safety issue of this.
Safety issue.
So what about just flat out?
It's more than safety. It's safety, fairness, competitiveness. There's just something that people are thinking, no, we had Title IX for a reason.
Yeah. Now, in terms of biological males who say that they identify as women, do people think they should be allowed to participate? Shouldn't? Where does America come down on that?
America overwhelmingly says no. 18% of voters, fewer than 1 out of 5, think this should be allowed. 70% say no. We did some other interesting polling around this topic and asked parents, or we asked voters, if their local schools let biological males play in women's sports. And hardly anybody thinks that's allowed where they live. So there's some misinformation. Overwhelmingly, they tell us that parents would be offended if they learned that this was going on.
You know, I like looking for the different angles and things. And I have a different perspective on this. At one of my kids' schools, the male wrestling team competed against a team from another school, which had a girl on it. And because they didn't have a girls' team, so they said, "Okay, you're on the boys' wrestling team." The coach told the boys at our school that if you do not win in the first 60 seconds, you will not win, because when you go out there, you're going to have to grab every part of a girl that you've been told not to touch, not to think about. Don't do this the rest of the day. And sure enough, the girl was very successful, but it didn't seem fair.
Well, that is a unique perspective. When I was a high school hockey player, there was a girl who said she wanted to come out for our team, and the coach said fine, and then she never showed up. But that was before Title IX.
Yeah.
I mean, look, women's sports have come a long way, and I think that's part of where this divide is right now, because what we're seeing is all kinds of records are being set by biological males in women's sports. Doesn't seem right. If I polled about this several years ago, people would have thought of it as a theoretical event and not really processed it. But over time, the opposition to letting biological males play has been growing.
Well, I think that you've been seeing the results, and there is that smell factor of the fairness that just doesn't seem to fit. It is your turn to be on our show. There's a QR code right down there below me. And if you scan that code, it's going to take you to a page where you can ask Scott anything you want. It is your way to be a part of us. We looked in the mailbag, and last week a bunch of people wrote in. One person in particular said, how is RFK Jr. doing in the presidential polling, and could he affect the race? Scott?
So the numbers right now show that Robert Kennedy is doing somewhere in the low double digits, and he seems to be taking equally from President Biden and President Trump. not really having much of a net impact. We asked about the upcoming debates. 46% of voters say it should really just be between Biden and Trump. A nearly equal number say, no, actually Kennedy should be in. This is the kind of a situation where in a close race, anything can make a difference.
Yeah, we'll see. I think it could be very interesting. Now, before we go, there was a really interesting headline in the New York Times this week. Surgeon General, why I'm calling for a warning label on social media platforms. So, Scott, as parents, we understand the issues with social media. What are Americans saying?
You know, if you ask about a question, are you concerned about social media? Absolutely. Parents say yes. A lot of people want to do things like ban TikTok or prevent kids from using it. On the other hand, there's a little bit of reluctance to talk about giving the government more power. One of the reasons for that, only 16% of voters think the federal government should be allowed to censor social media posts. I know this is just a warning.
This is just a warning. Actually, I mean, it sounded kind of smart to me. You've got to think it through, though.
Right. And most members of the elite 1% that we've talked about say, well, actually, no, the federal government should have the ability to censor social media posts. So there's a sense
and everything
of
else.
And everything else, that's right. So that's where the disconnect comes. How do you address serious issues like this without having the government order a top-down solution?
Government or the people who figure that out?
There you go.
Usually people are a little bit smarter. Now, we're just about out of time. We talked about a lot of numbers on the show today, but you don't have to remember all of them. There's always just one really important one that Scott picks out. So what is it this week?
Well, this week on the 52nd anniversary of Title IX, 70% of voters say biological males who identify as women should not be allowed to participate in women's sports. That's all for this week's edition of the Scott Rasmussen Show. I hope you'll stay connected with us on social media all through the week. For Edie Hill and the entire team that helped put this show together, I'm Scott Rasmussen. America, have a great week.